guys, so I'm here today to do the fourth installment in my young adult to adult book recommendation series. So if you've only joined me recently, you might not be familiar with this series, but over the past few years I have done 3 videos in which I take a young adult book that I enjoyed and recommend and find an adult book that I would compare to it that I think if you like the young adult book you might like this adult book. The purpose of which is to help those of you who are perhaps looking to get into more adult literature and have not been sure where to start, but also just for those of you that enjoyed any of the books I've mentioned in this video and would like a similar recommendation. So even if it's the adult book you've read and not the young adult book, I would highly recommend checking out whichever book I pair with it. So without further ado, let's get into the recommendations. So the first book on my list is actually the one that I've read most recently and really brought home for me that I needed to do another one of these videos because it just seemed like the perfect book to mention. And that is Tangleweed Brain by Deirdre Sullivan. So this is a collection of young adult fairy tale retellings. Now these fairy tale retellings cover some of the fairy tales I'm sure you're all familiar with, like Snow White, Cinderella, as well as some that you might have come across but are fainter in the background of your memory because they haven't perhaps had Disney films made out of them. But they all explore these stories from the perspective of the women within them and kind of try and explore how the women would have been feeling in the situations they've been placed in, which are quite often dark, sometimes abusive situations, and Deirdre really tries to pull and pick that apart, and it's so interesting to read and so thought-provoking and hard-hitting and beautifully written. It explores themes like abusive relationships, independence, body image, lots of things that are incredibly relevant to people today in today's society, but through these tales that you are perhaps familiar with some version or another of. And I thoroughly recommend this collection to anyone that enjoys fairy tales, retellings, short story collections, or a little bit of fantasy and magic. And for an adult comparison, this was a little bit difficult because there are a few excellent adult fairy tale retelling collections, but I thought I would go for one of the original old school recommendations that I'm just certain if you enjoyed Tangleweed Brain you will enjoy, and that is The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. So this is another collection of fairy tale retellings, including the title story The Bloody Chamber, which retells the story of Bluebeard, a story you will also find in Tangleweed Brain. There are also various other stories retold in there, including Little Red Riding Hood, Beauty and the Beast, and Puss in Boots. And in fact, in the 1980s, a film was released called The Company of Wolves, which was inspired by the Wolf and Little Red Riding Hood tales of this collection. Once again, this collection explores themes of sex, sexuality, and violence, underpinning the original violence and darker images from the original fairy tales and kind of trying to hone in and explore those and what they mean and what they meant for the characters. And it's beautifully, eloquently written. Angela Carter has a stunning way with words, and if you're at all interested in any of these themes or genres, then this is a must read. And if you have enjoyed The Bloody Chamber, then I would suggest perhaps checking out Tangleweed Brain. Next up, I'm actually going to mention a young adult book that's actually based on an adult book, but sometimes this can pass us by, or we might just not think to read the adult equivalent. And they're both books I really enjoy, but actually for quite different reasons, because I think the young adult version really makes the story its own. The young adult book I'm talking about is The Fallen Children by David Owen. This book is inspired by The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham, which was a mid-20th century science fiction novel, and John Wyndham has written some of my favourite science fiction novels in the past. So when I found out about The Fallen Children, I was of course intrigued, and I loved this book. It centres on a group of young women who live on a council estate in London, and something quite disturbing happens to them one night whereby they all wake up the next morning and find themselves pregnant. Now, this is a science fiction novel, so the presumption is that this pregnancy is somehow otherworldly, that it has come upon them because of some off-earth race, and they have in a way been violated. And it takes a story that is, like I've mentioned, based on a classic, but really uses it to pick apart modern themes of sexual violence, of class, of poverty, of growing up, being a teenager, of relationships, and it is so well done. This is a phenomenal read and I just cannot recommend it more highly. I think it was just expertly done. It took an interesting concept from an earlier novel and really made it relevant to today, and it was incredibly creative. Now the story it is based on is The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham, which is a classic science fiction novel that I do enjoy. So The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham is set in the village of Midwich, in which one day all of the women in Midwich wake up and find themselves pregnant. And it's about how they have become pregnant and what the children they give birth to are like, and it's all a little bit scary and horrific, and when the children are born they all look very similarly and they band together in this sort of little clan to themselves, and it's really fascinating, kind of unnerving, and a really interesting concept that's obviously given way to interesting concepts as time has gone on because it's inspired others. But I've always really enjoyed John Wyndham's writing. There's something so quintessentially English to it and it just feels so proper. People don't tend to go around running and screaming in these books. They're very sensible and converse with one another as if they were simply at a tea party with a bunch of people that they don't quite know, and it's really interesting to read, and I find his prose really pleasant, so I've always been a big fan of his science fiction novels. But if you have in the past found yourself enjoying John Wyndham novels, then please do read The Fallen Children. But if you've been watching any of my videos recently, you will know that I have been obsessed with fairy books. Books that deal with the fair folk tales and fairy lore have been number one on my TBR and reading lists, and I have been thoroughly enjoying them, and I have read a few adult and young adult versions, so I thought those of you that are perhaps fantasy fans and interested in reading more books with fairies at the centre might enjoy these next two recommendations. The young adult book I want to mention is The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. So what I enjoy about The Cruel Prince by Holly Black is it really harkens back to the kind of darkness of the original kind of folk tales. So from my experience of reading and being told Celtic and Scottish folk tales as a child was that the fairies could be pretty evil and could kind of ruin lives, and that was really fascinating to me, and this story very much takes a hold of that concept and uses it at its centre. It follows three young girls who one day at home are just spending the evening with their parents when a man comes knocking at their door. Now this man kills both of their parents as he's actually the biological father of their eldest sister and a fairy, making their eldest sister half fairy, whereas the two younger sisters are both mortals. However, the fairy that kills their parents takes all three back with him to the fairy realm to raise as his own, and it's about them growing up in the fairy realm, and as our protagonists are now teenagers, dealing with the political upheaval in the fairy world that they're getting dragged into. It very much deals with the darker side of fairies. It can be quite a violent story, but it's also an engaging fantasy story with fun characters that you want to know what's going to happen at the end, and it's the first in a series with future books coming out that aren't yet released as of July 2018. But my recommendation for those of you that have enjoyed The Cruel Prince or any of Holly Black's other fairy focused young adult novels is the first in the Seven Waters series by Juliette Marillier. This is called Daughter of the Forest, and it's set in medieval Ireland as opposed to the modern day, but it is a fantasy book, it's a high fantasy book, and it very much has the feeling of being set in a fantasy world even if it's not directly set in the world of the Fae. Our main character Sorcha actually has a close relationship with the Fae in this world, who like to appear to her and talk to her and meddle in the goings on of the humans as they see fit. So it does very much have fairies at the centre. It's also quite often a dark, gritty fantasy novel where really tragic things do happen. The initial premise is that Sorcha's 6 brothers are cursed by their father's new wife, who is a sorceress, and Sorcha must set off to break this curse as she's been instructed to do by the fairies. And we follow her journey as she tries to save herself and her brothers as according to the fairies' rules, and kind of defeat this evil sorceress. It is beautifully slow-paced, yet so intricately woven and detailed that you cannot put this book down. It's so immersive, and there's always something to keep you engaged, and brilliant, brilliant characters who you can't help but fall in love with. But last but certainly not least, I'm going to mention The Surface Breaks by Louise O'Neill. So The Surface Breaks actually takes us back to our fairy tale retelling of the beginning of this video, although fantasy and fairies have certainly been a theme throughout. The Surface Breaks is a retelling of The Little Mermaid, and it's a wonderful retelling of the original Hans Christian Andersen story. It mainly adheres to that story line in the original fairy tale, but it is so much more fleshed out. It's set initially in this underwater kingdom of the mermaids, where the mermaids live under a strict patriarchal rule, and the women are very much just there to do the bidding of the men, as kind of trading tools between royal and high up men in the kingdom. And our group of mermaid sisters, which include the Little Mermaid, are very much a part of this system. However, our main mermaid wants to know what's going on in the world above, and she gets her wish. And all this book does take things that go on in our real world and really magnifies them within the mermaid world. It also shines a light on the sexism and misogyny in the world above the water, on the earth, where mortals like us live. And it's so powerful, impactful, really highlights the darkness of the original fairy tale, and doesn't shy away from that, but instead shows how dark that is, and kind of tries to provide the main character with new opportunity to change her story. And it's so wonderfully, wonderfully done. Louise O'Neill is queen of young adult novels in my opinion. Everything she writes is fantastic and powerful and insightful, as is this. But I thought I would recommend, on the back of that, The Gracekeepers by Kirsty Logan. So this book also involves mermaids, or mermen, or merfolk, although a little bit more subtly. It's a sort of magical realism type story set in a sort of fantastical world, although the magic is at a lower level. It's not constantly magic in your face, It's hinted at here and there, and it's set in a world where the planet is almost entirely flooded. So people either live on very, very small islands in little communities, or on boats and on floating platforms. And we follow 2 characters, one of whom is a gracekeeper and is responsible for the dead and helping them pass on and sending their bodies into the water, and the other of whom lives on a travelling circus boat and has a bear who she performs with. And it's about both of these young women's lives, how they intersect, what their place is in the world that they currently live in, and how their lives are changing and how they can change each other's lives. And it's such a beautiful story. The main characters are so, so wonderful, and seeing their stories begin to interweave is so wonderful to follow. Kirsty Logan writes beautiful prose. She has a couple of short story collections which are just absolutely stunning, and her prose is eloquent in this novel as well. This is in part inspired by old Scottish folk tales, and those elements are weaved within the story, just as they often are in Kirsty Logan's short stories. And it deals with themes of isolation and loneliness, which I also think are present in The Surface Breaks, as although our main character is constantly surrounded by others, she has her voice taken away from her and often feels completely alone. So if you're drawn to water-based folk and fairy tales and mermaids, then I would check out both of these novels. But those are my recommendations for this instalment of YA to adult book recommendations. If you haven't seen my previous 3 videos in this series, I will of course link them down below. And I would love to hear both what your favourite young adult novel is, but also what adult books would you recommend to those who are just trying to get into reading more adult fiction. And do of course let me know what you think of any of the books I've mentioned in this video. I always love talking about them with you guys. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye!